The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fifth webinar of the COVID-19 Best Practices and Lessons Learned webinar series. My name is Christine Walsh, and I serve as the Assistant Director for EMAP. Also joining me today from EMAP staff is Mr. David Liebman, who will assist with addressing your questions in the chat function. Today, we'll be hearing from how Gwinnett County, Hamilton County, and Washoe County coordinated with their stakeholders to ensure that their jurisdictions continue to provide essential program functions throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. Throughout the webinar, feel free to input your questions into the chat function. We will address your questions at the conclusion of the webinar, so let's go ahead and get started. We have three special guests joining us today for the webinar. I was hoping to get Mr. Swanson, Mr. Crossley, and Ms. Echeverria an opportunity to introduce themselves.
Hello, everyone. My name is Greg Swanson. As you can see there on the screen, I'm the Director of Emergency Management for Gwinnett County, Georgia. We're a community of roughly 1 million people. We have 16 cities that we serve, as well as our county government. We're a unit of the county government here, but we also serve our cities as their emergency management agency. As far as EMAP experience, I've been involved with EMAP for a little over 15 years. I've served as a accreditation manager at the state level when I was working for the state of Georgia and took them through their initial accreditation many years ago. And then after leaving the state of Georgia and coming to the county level, I remained involved with EMAP as an assessor. I'm now an assessment team lead. I assist with training such as this and serve on some of the standards committees. So I look forward to being with you this afternoon.
Thanks, Greg. Mr. Crossley?
Good morning, Nick Crossley. I'm the Director of Emergency Management and Homeland Security for Hamilton County, Ohio. Pretty sure there's a Hamilton County in every state in the union, so I'd like to clarify that. I also currently serve as the chair of the EMAP Commission and have been involved with EMAP since 2003 as an assessor, committee member, and now on the EMAP Commission representing the International Association of Emergency Managers. As far as from a program perspective, we began our quest for, joined Hamilton County, Ohio in 2015. We began our quest for accreditation in 2016, knowing that I felt to do it right, we had to sort of ingratiate the standards, understand the standards, train staff on the standards, and then build up support countywide. Our agency is a little unique. We are an independent countywide agency that serves as the emergency manager for all 49 communities within Hamilton County. We have about 800,000 residents sitting on the banks of the Ohio River. We recently were accredited in July of 21, and basically we're delayed about 6 months because of COVID on our end goal of being accredited by the end of 2020. So we're very proud of that fact. That's me. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Ms. Echeverria?
Yeah, hi, I'm Kelly Echeverria. I'm the Emergency Management Administrator for Washoe County. Our region has a population of a little over 460,000, so we have a wide geographical area, but we're pretty condensed in the southern portion of the county. We support the two cities of Reno and Sparks, and the two tribes of Pyramid Lake Paiute Tribe and Reno Sparks Indian Colony, as well as unincorporated Washoe. I've been involved with EMAP since 2018, but our program has been accredited twice, once in 2015 and again in 2021. Was a bit of a challenge the second go around, well, both, but the second go around more specifically because of COVID, and I believe we were one of the first ones to be assessed virtually. So that was challenging, but we made it through. So I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you today. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. For today's presentation, we're going to walk through some continuity definitions and standards. We're going to let Greg talk about Gwinnett County continuity of operations. Nick will discuss Hamilton County, Ohio's continuity of operations, and Kelly will discuss Washoe County continuity of operations. And then we'll have some best practices and lessons learned, and then a question and answer session. First, let's go ahead and begin with the EMAP definitions and standards that we will be discussing today. If anyone is actually looking at the emergency management standard, you can refer to these definitions on page 4. Specifically for this one is Chapter 2, Definition 2.7 for essential program functions. This definition to EMAP is that activities that enable an agency, department, organization, or individual to carry out emergency response actions, to provide vital services, to protect the safety and well-being of the citizens of the program's jurisdiction, and to maintain the economic base of the program. This definition will specifically align with the standards in 442 and 445, which we will be presenting today. In addition to the essential program functions, we would go ahead and define continuity of operations as the capability to continue essential program functions and to preserve essential processes and functions, positions, lines of succession, applications and records, communications, and facilities across the broad range of the potential emergencies or disasters. This definition is specific to, again, standards 441, 442, and 445 that we will be presenting today. We'll go ahead and start with standard 411. Standard 411 requires programs to assess the risk and vulnerability of their own operations for the natural and human caused hazards that potentially impact the jurisdiction. This component explores how susceptible the program's operations, including continuity of operations, are to the identified hazards. Throughout the rest of the standard, there are references back to this list of hazards in standard 411 that requires consistency across plans and procedures. Specifically for today's webinar, standard 441 in the current 2019 emergency management standard. As a note, with the release of the upcoming 2022 emergency management standard that will be released in early 2023, there will be the requirement for all COOP plans to address the hazards identified in standard 411. Next, we'll move on to standard 441 that requires that the emergency management program has developed 4 plans. Please note that the plans have a capital P, which means that these plans need to be formalized documents. Standard 441 requires programs to develop an emergency management program or agency COOP plan with stakeholders. It is important for stakeholders to be involved in the development of the emergency management program COOP plan because they may be asked to assist in continuing the coordination functions performed by the emergency management program or agency. The emergency management program COOP plan must also address the hazards identified in standard 411. Considering the different hazards, both natural and human cause, that could potentially impact the jurisdiction from a continuity standpoint is critical. It is imperative that programs be consistent with their hazards. A common pitfall is the presence of different hazards lists in these plans that are contrary to the hazards identified in standard 411. Please make sure that there is connective tissue between the hazards in standard 411 and the plans identified in this standard. Prior to COVID-19, many continuity plans were simply relocation plans. But as we all know, now that continuity planning is larger than just relocation. We'll move on to standard 442, which first requires programs to identify their essential program functions and the departments responsible for performing the identified essential program functions. Again, this goes back to the definition of essential program functions that we discussed earlier. The program must determine all of its departments, agencies, and organizations, which ones are essential and then identify them in a formal document for the assessor to understand how many COOP plans will need to be assessed for both standards 442 and 445. Keep in mind that the same COOP plans presented for standard 442 will also be reviewed and considered for standard 445. If the department COOP plans are standalone plan, each plan must contain each of the elements in the standard. If there is an emergency management program COOP plan with annexes for departmental COOP plans, then the base COOP plan must contain all of these elements. All of the departments and/or agencies that perform essential program functions must submit a COOP plan, whether they are standalone or whether they are within a larger document as a base plan. If the department COOP plan, standard 442 is especially helpful for new programs that have not yet established departmental continuity plans or annexes. The components of the standard 442 align with planning best practices. Next, we'll move on to standard 445. Standard 445 subelement 1 requires programs to identify processes and functions that will be continued and recovered for each department that performs an essential program functions. Oftentimes, essential program functions are very broad statements. There's no description of how the functions are performed. That is where processes come in. How are these functions performed? We need to understand what the process is as a series of related tasks or methods that together turn inputs into outputs. The process is the what and is often depicted in a flow chart or a workflow diagram. Once the processes and functions are identified, then they need to be prioritized for recovery. Standard 445 subelement 2 and subelement 3 requires programs to identify essential position and lines of succession for each essential program COOP plan. Standard 445 subelement 4 requires programs to identify the critical applications and vital records that are needed to continue and recover the department's processes and functions. Once the critical applications and vital records are identified, the program then needs to address how those identified critical applications and vital records are safeguarded. Standard 445 subelement 5 then requires programs to identify the communications resources needed to continue and recover the department's processes and functions. Standard 445 subelement 6 requires programs to identify the vital resources needed to continue and recover the department's processes and functions. Vital resources often include the equipment, supplies, and facilities needed to continue and recover the department's processes and functions. Once those have been identified, the vital resources need to be prioritized for recovery. Lastly, Standard 445 subelement 7 requires programs to identify each department's alternate operating capability. This can include an alternate facility, the requirements needed for an alternate facility, a hybrid approach where some folks can network while others need to be physically present, or the ability for the entire department to telework. Alternate operating capability provides a department with flexibility in determining its ability to continue its operation for a variety of different circumstances. Standard 447 requires programs to develop implementation procedures for the emergency management program COOP plans that addresses the hazards identified in Standard 411. What EMAP is looking for in procedures is that they are detailed written description of activities to implement the emergency operations plan, the recovery plan, the emergency management continuity of operations plan, and the continuity of government plan. These plans are identified in Standard 441. Programs will often provide implementation processes for assessors to review for Standard 447. One of the things that's probably particular to mention here and very important is how procedure EMAP describes procedures or defines procedures. They are in fact described or defined as a prescribed way of undertaking a process or a process step. Procedure is the how. It describes who is responsible for each step of the process, when each process step occurs, and any additional specifications applicable to each process step. Programs will often provide implementation processes that address the steps that need to be taken to implement the plans. For example, a process step is to notify key decision makers of an impending or imminent disaster. Procedures would require an expansion to this process step and include information pertaining to who is responsible for notifying those key decision makers, how those key decision makers are notified, and the information that needs to be provided to the key decision makers, and how the decisions made by the key decision makers are then implemented and by whom. Examples of other implementation activities include possibly an analysis of the situation, identification of the needs of the affected areas, departments and leadership, identification of the appropriate activation levels, and notification of plan implementation, etc. Standard 449 requires programs to establish a maintenance process for the implementation procedures for the Emergency Management Program COOP plan. If the program has embedded the implementation procedures in the Emergency Management Program COOP plan, the maintenance process for the Emergency Management Program COOP plan established in Standard 442 Subelement 7 will apply to the implementation procedures. At this time, I'll go ahead and turn the presentation over to Mr. Greg Swanson with Gwinnett County to share their COVID-19 best practices and lessons learned for continuity planning.
All right, thank you, Christine. Again, I look forward to having some dialogue and discussion with you all this afternoon. I'll present our information really in sort of three different phases. We'll talk a little bit about pre-COVID, what was going on in our community prior to the start. And then we'll discuss a little bit of our initial response as it relates to continuity and the use of our continuity plans and procedures. And then the EMAP staff asked if I would speak a little bit about maybe some of the challenges that we had going virtual. So my comments will sort of be framed around those three elements. So prior to COVID, the way things were set up here, we did have existing COOP and COG plans. We began COOP planning back in 2008. So it had involved all of our county departments, our court system, our constitutional offices. So here in Georgia, that means like your sheriff's office, your tax assessor, they're separate elected officials. And I can't give enough credit to the leadership back in 2008, our county administrator, who wanted to take that much of a broad approach and not just focus on the 10 or so county departments, what we call county departments that report up to our elected Board of Commissioners. They empowered us in the Office of Emergency Management to really reach across what we call enterprise-wide. And you know, assist those departments and those constitutional offices and the judges and the court system to all engage in continuity planning. So I say that to just say COOP wasn't new to us when COVID came to visit. The departments, they had identified their mission essential functions. They had prioritized those. Some of the things we'll talk about maybe in the lessons learned, the prioritization of those mission essential functions. We had done that based on a 1 day, a 1 week, or a 30-day disruption. So you can probably already pick out some of our lessons learned there with some of the planning assumptions that we had going into COOP and the length of the potential disruptions. The way that we maintain our COOP plans is from our office, we send out quarterly reminders with usually a suggested topic to all of our COOP planners across our departments. And just a reminder, hey, go in your COOP plan take a look at, pick a topic. So we do quarterly topics, and then once a year we host an in-person workshop. They're not mandatory, but any department that wants to send their staff to the annual COOP workshop is welcome to do so. And we assist them with some one-on-one assistance working on their COOP plans. If they have changes going on that they need some help with, or they want to bounce some ideas off our staff and that sort of thing. So we do those annually. Now compare that to what we do with our emergency operations plan. Pick an annex out of an emergency operations plan. Let's say maybe debris management. Well, our evaluation cycle is we're really only going to take a deep dive look at that every 3 years. But when we started COOP planning, we decided that it was such a different animal. And there was the opportunity for changes, especially in staff, with just routine, regular staff turnover. Your key staff positions and those people that you're going to depend on to do your mission essential functions, the opportunity that we had for turnover, we decided that we were going to go with the quarterly reminders and then the annual workshops. And I think that's ended up being a real blessing for us to keep COOP sort of in people's minds. So they at least hear about it 4 times a year. So that's worked very well for us. Our COOP plans really improved as we were preparing for our accreditation effort with EMAP, which it culminated with our on-site assessment the 4th quarter of 2019. So we were just finishing our, accreditation effort when COVID began, the 1st quarter of 2020. So I tell people that although we had been working to get elements of our program to meet the EMAP standard, we had been doing that for several years. I tell them, the day that COVID came, our program was probably as good as it's ever been because we had been making that focused effort, that last, down the home stretch there, that last 6 months, 8 months, and really engaging all of our stakeholders across our enterprise organization. So we were probably in about as good a shape as we were going to be when COVID came. And we had used the standard over the years to build program areas. If we needed a new plan or we were evaluating a process or a procedure, we turned first to the standard and looked to see what it required. And if we were going to be revising a plan, process, or procedure, we made sure we did so that it would, meet the intent of the EMAP standard. So the standard was a great roadmap for us. It really helped, shore up some of our holes and gaps that we had, and we had some, in COOP plans and our COG plans. So that was really good. Some of the things that as we began to talk about moving from pre-COVID into initial response, and Christine, you can flip the slide anytime. I mentioned that we had done COOP planning enterprise-wide across our entire organization. So that's 34 COOP plans for us. I mentioned that they all received, some routine evaluation and revision. They had all been exercised at some point, and some of them had actually been utilized in real life events. But we had never implemented all 34 of them simultaneously. So that was certainly a challenge of our preliminary response is, again, enterprise-wide, everybody is jumping into implementing COOP plans simultaneously. So we had some priority setting and some deconfliction to do, but we can discuss that a little bit more later. But Our preliminary response, we were, again, I can't speak enough about our leadership, our county administrator and our elected board of commissioners. We got very early engagement from them and direction. Well before we had a case in our county or even in our state, we had been activated and we were engaged. And our county administrator established an executive policy group, and that goes in keeping with our planning process. Our emergency operations plan calls for an executive policy group, and he created that early, and they met daily in the beginning. They met every day, and they're still meeting now. Our executive policy group, we had a meeting this morning just prior to this, and we're working on the after action process. So that group being established early and receiving clear direction and priorities from leadership was very helpful. That early direction set clear roles for our public health department, our office in emergency management, and other county departments. The county administrator was very clear in his expectation that we remain committed to maintaining the provision of all of our essential services. That certainly became a challenge, but that was his goal. The bar that he set for us was to work our mission essential functions, work them across the entire enterprise, and maintain provision of those essential services. And that executive policy group was very, very instrumental in deconflicting conflicts, assessing or assisting in setting priorities across the organization. You know, everybody needed to do their number one mission essential function, had to do it. No problem. We worked through those. But when you get down to the number twos and the number threes where you're competing for resources. And so, we certainly couldn't do all of the number twos, threes, and fours across 34 business units. But fortunately, for our office in emergency management, we were not tasked with prioritizing those. We used that executive policy group to help prioritize those and give us really the mission and the task, and then we knew who to support and how to support them. So that was very, very key because we couldn't have done it all, not simultaneously. So getting that early direction from the leadership, they were very clear in their expectations. Establishing that policy group that I mentioned hasn't gone away. We're still here today. And really setting those priorities that assisted us in getting off what I would say is on the right foot, and it did start smooth. So some of the challenges of going virtual, we had a good telework policy prior to COVID. Departments could choose to allow teleworking or not depending on the job function, and to be honest, there was very little teleworking going on in Gwinnett County prior to COVID. But we did have the policy and the structure and those types of things that were in place. As far as our office here in emergency management, it was part of our plan. Christine mentioned earlier that, a lot of plans were just like relocation plans, and ours went a little deeper than that. Certainly we have a primary facility and an alternate facility, and then, our third level of redundancy was going to be to work remote and to work virtual. The technology was in place for all of our staff. It had been practiced, and the transition was easy. When the directives came from, the county leadership for social distancing and remote working and teleworking, it was very simple for us to just tell our staff, okay, you go, work from home. You're already set up, you have all your equipment. The only thing we had to acquire, I believe, was one extra cell phone, and that was for our staff assistant. We got a cell phone for her. We forwarded the office line to her, and she worked remote from home. And that's the only piece of equipment that we had to acquire, at least, for our office here in emergency management. In other departments, prior to COVID, they had really only set up virtual working for some key staff people. And certainly COVID required us to get much, much deeper in the organization in order for us to continue on with all of our essential functions. So we had to go beyond the people who were, just your leadership or your deputy directors or things like that. So COVID required a much broader use of the virtual work for a much longer period of time than we had initially thought. Our IT department did a great job. They worked very well to increase our capacity and our capabilities. We still joke today, they threw so many virtual platforms at us at once. That almost became a bit of a challenge to know which virtual platform was connected to who and who you could meet with on what. We got it all figured out, but that took a minute. And then we realized there were things that absolutely you needed face-to-face. While we were, activated at the EOC, and we were doing that in a virtual environment, we tried to do a lot of things virtually, but as it continued and it got more complex, we had to bring our staff back in. So our EM staff came back to work a lot sooner than some of the other county staff did, just because the nature of the work, it just couldn't be done efficiently and effectively in a remote setting. So we ended up bringing our folks back in pretty early. We weren't out remote for very long. And even things that initially we thought in a planning process that would work remotely, like a call center. We had a call center here in the EOC as a part of our Joint Information Center. We expanded its capability with number of lines and with number of seats, and we thought early on that we could have done that virtually, and it just didn't work. So the EOC, while it was virtually activated for some, the JIC function, they ended up being here, and especially the call center. It ended up being staffed with about 30 people, here live, if you will. The virtual just didn't work for that. So those are sort of the things that sort of took us through, again, the pre-COVID, our initial response, and then some of the challenges of going virtual. So I think Mr. Crosley is up next.
Yes, he is. Thank you so much, Greg. We truly appreciate it. And Nick, I'll go ahead and turn over the presentation to you, sir.
Thank you. Greg, that was impressive. So let me just say that. Although I would expect nothing less down there around Atlanta. So Nick Crossley, again, Hamilton County, Ohio, 49 communities, emergency management, basically at the county level, but work with all of our communities at the same time. Next slide. So this is our county structure. Again, not much different from what my colleague just described. We have departments under the board. I have 8 different elected officials, not including the courts. Everybody with, everything from communications director who's used to the cloud, who embraces technology, to an auditor who still sends all of our financial records to Iron Mountain. I think that's in Georgia, and brings in data trucks to do recovery. So the whole range of from a continuity perspective and what that means and that kind of thing. Next slide. So we began as we began digging into EMAP, and of course I know after 20 plus years in emergency management the importance of continuity of operations. It's a challenging subject to broach. So I always say, part of our job in emergency management is get people to think about things they don't want to think about, spend money they think they don't have on something they hope will never happen. And so we always approached COOP, as my colleague said, from a temporary displacement perspective rather than an extended displacement caused by COVID to many departments and agencies. My agency never went remote, and we've never had a COVID case in the office. There's 10 of us, but we're fairly spread out. And then we practice a lot of mitigation. So very fortunate for the 2 years we were knee deep in COVID, we were never remote. However, most county departments and agencies were remote or shut down, one of the two, for example, like the courts. As a note on here, 13 departments under the county administrators, 9 independent elected officials with own staff, 25 other organizations, agency departments that are sort of affiliated, funded by, connected to the county, but not necessarily run by the county. And of course, we try to work with all of these entities. We did use the FEMA, so I do have certified COOP planners on staff, plus I've studied COOP since, again, the 1999. And then, of course, using the EMAP standards, and they're pretty similar as far as what should be in a COOP plan. And we manage our COOP program with basically, so I have an assistant planner, and part of her time is spent managing and encouraging all these COOP plans and trainings and exercises. And we do a different approach. Of course, we encourage it organization-wide. However, we focus on, because of EMAP standards, are really, and what our major function is in the county, we focus on agencies or departments, both internal and external, that have a primary role in the Emergency Operations Center, which is the lead or the coordinating agency or department. That's what we focus on. This is the list of those right there that basically I pulled this from our current update plan. So obviously our COOP, our county engineer who handles debris management, debris removal, environmental services, that's self-explanatory. The county, I have 40 fire departments, but we do not actually own a fire department. So we work with the Chiefs Association, and we wrote a COOP for them. Job and Family Services, which is our human service agency. The LAPC, I'm sure most of you are familiar with that. I have 4 health departments, but we primarily work with the one with Hamilton County in front of their name, although they are independent under their own board. Sheriff's Office, again, another independent elected. Soil and Water Conservation works with the county, but has their own board. And then we have an organization called the Health Collaborative, which coordinates hospital emergency response. And so we work with them and help them with their continuity of operations plan. And so this is how we sort of approached it beginning. We actually started right before COVID hit, right before COVID shut everything down. We reinvigorated our process, knowing that in a year/2 years, we were seeking full EMAP accreditation. So that began in 2019. Next slide. So challenges. So obviously working with appointed and elected leaders with varying levels of influence. So love that Gwinnett County, with the support of the board and the administrator, we're really able to get a lot of people on board. Ours is a little different. We have elected leaders from both parties, so that's always interesting to see that interaction. We have people like myself who run independent countywide agencies that that work with the county but don't have to do what they're told by the county, so to speak. Then you had the challenges of COVID, and I have COVID in here twice because it caused many, many challenges, as we all know. One of the biggest challenges was having to go remote for an extended period with Hamilton County. They're still buying desktops, which I found amazing. Much like my colleague in Gwinnett County, I was fully prepared to work from anywhere, so no problem for us. VPN access, laptops, air cards, phones that could provide internet. I mean, the whole bit. No problem for emergency management. However, the county struggled with VPN access. They struggled with laptops because by then everybody was buying laptops and you couldn't get one. All that kind of stuff. Getting the right staff to address needed issues. So that was always a challenge. Getting a hold of people was a challenge at times, but not too bad. It was just a real shift, especially the long-term component. And then of course I just go back to COVID. It was just one of those things that I think a lot of people didn't think was going to happen. We talked about it in COOP planning, and a lot of the agencies and departments we work directly with, I think we're a bit better prepared to deal with it. But then there are a lot of departments and agencies that were voluntarily part of the program, and some of them more prepared than others. So next slide. So the benefits of EMAP. So how do we used it? So basically, using the old EMAP requires it. We're trying to get the county program accredited. Would you help? And so it really helped motivate people, especially our primary agencies and departments, complete their continuity of operations plan. We did a lot of tabletop exercises. It did identify, I think, between the time we really got knee deep in it and COVID hit, not a lot of time to address the gaps, but at least they were identified, which helped them a little bit get ahead of the curve when some of them had to go remote. So when I say remote, Job and Family Services went remote, which is our primary helping to coordinate mass care, but us and the communication center never went remote, if you can imagine that. So I think an overall benefit of accreditation or following the standard, even if you don't get accredited, it's just the increased documentation. So basically, I'm a firm believer, and granted I am the chair of EMAP, but I've been a firm believer since 2003, that there's nothing in EMAP that an emergency management program shouldn't be doing. It may be somewhat painful, it may be somewhat tedious, but documenting what we do and how we do it and why we do it in emergency management, when your whole influence on your organization usually is to develop relationships and get people to do things, to cajole them, manipulate them in a good way, whatever it might be. The documentation helps you with that. Why are we doing what we're doing? It's a recognized national standard by FEMA. It's a recognized national standard by all the major emergency management organizations, the National Association of Counties. I mean, so it's got wide recognition. There's no reason why you shouldn't document your critical processes and functions. Again, with COOP, it helped identify essential positions with lines of succession. So that's always interesting. So I don't know how many times, just today, I was talking to somebody about a grant and asked how to get a hold of their grants person. And they said, well, it's so-and-so, but she's out with COVID. And so I don't know how many times all of us experienced that. So that was kind of crazy as well. ID critical applications and vital records. So again, even if they hadn't quite worked out what they were going to do, they, at least by 2019, into the early part of COVID, by the end of COVID, we had it all worked out, obviously, but at least identifying what are those critical applications and vital records that you have to have on a daily basis. We all have, as government, we all have a lot of records, but the stuff you really need to be able to get your hands on is probably somewhat limited. It identified the gaps on communications resources. So again, phones, computers, VPN access, that became critical. So I think they expanded their VPN access by 500%. Just so many people that they, for whatever reasons, I always encourage departments to really take a good look on who needs to be able to access at home. That requires some change in HR policies, because giving people access after hours to networks can cause HR issues, you know, with unions and things like that. But they had to expand all of that quickly. And then alternate operating capabilities. So this varied between spreading out within an office space to spreading out among office spaces. So the county has, one of the challenges was, and my colleague in Gwinnett County pointed this out, is that we considered short-term relocation, but never long-term. I thought about long-term relocation. A lot of times our colleagues didn't. But when every single building you own is impacted, that's a whole nother world, right? You always, in some ways, we're not in hurricane country, so you always assume there's a county building somewhere that we can find space in. But when you have a fast spreading virus like COVID, that's not much use. So that was interesting, which is why you had to do the hybrid workplace in a lot of times, so that you didn't have as many people in. What we also found was plan testing and maintenance was helpful to justify ongoing activities. So that's always, I always tell people, you know, anybody can get through a disaster eventually. But wouldn't it be better if you plan, trained, and exercise? And this is the process we take with COOP planning. And now with COVID, we'll always, I think I'm good with that example for at least 10 years before people, especially in leadership, start retiring, many of them that are still here. And so we have an opportunity to reemphasize the plan, testing, and maintenance process. We're actually getting ready to do a workshop in June to bring people back in to talk about their plans. And then we truly believe it increases the resilience of the organization. So our county, while we may not have been in the office in some ways, it increased the resilience of the organization, increases the computer capacity, the network capacity, the ability to do things online. It really challenged the organization and thereby increasing the resilience. And then having identified this via the COOP process, working with EMAP, really helped drive that home. And then again, from our perspective, we did focus, our agency focused directly on emergency management partners and then expanded to others. So we provide a lot of consultation, regardless of the agency or the organization, on continuity of operations. And then I view my job at the end of the day is to manage expectations as far as what you can expect from the county leadership and the county government, and then what is really on the independent, the individual department or agency on how they can mitigate the impact of something now through COOP planning rather than having to scramble during the event. And so all of this is all within the COOP planning framework in EMAP. And so by going through it and really forcing the issues, I think it helped a lot of the organizations that are critical organizations for the disaster response piece. And then of course, at the end of the day, all the relationships we've built throughout this entire process of COOP planning really paid off during COVID, because people would pick up the phone when you called. And as we all know, responding to and getting somebody to respond to an email or answer the phone when you call is just critical. And so by engaging with our partners on the planning process, going through and again trying to simplify it enough to where they're not overwhelmed, but making sure that they actually cover what they should cover, helping them, holding their hand, being there with them through that process really helped me be able to do my job and then help work with the county administration and the Board of County Commissioners, understanding impacts to the organizations from COVID. And then of course, during COVID, we had floods, we had high wind events, we had tornado events. I mean, you know, the other stuff never ends. Major transportation, hazardous materials. We have it all here. So it really, if you look at the components required by EMAP and you look at what you're trying to get these departments and agencies to do, it's just critical. And now we know through COVID that, and I've always said this, that no matter what disaster you're being impacted by, the business of government can never stop. And so what's critical that you keep going and making sure you can do, and what can slow down, because for example, if the planning department decides to stop reviewing plans, then what impact does that have on the economic viability of the county as a whole? Because businesses aren't able to expand, they're not able to come in, they're not able to do so many things that are critical. And so we work with them, they're one of our primary partners, to make sure that folks continue virtually and via the web versus contractors and builders and people like that having to come in and file their plans. So that was just one example of a benefit of COOP planning that really helped speed up the process. Next slide.
There is an, yeah,
Oh,
sorry.
good. All right. So that was really the benefits, and you know, I'm open to any questions. Again, we're continuing this process, and thankfully we do have COVID to build on as we move forward. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Nick. And next we'll move on to Kelly.
All right, thank you. Yeah, again, I'm from Washoe County. We're in Nevada. We are, you know, right by Tahoe and very far from Vegas. So we're in the northern part of the state. If you could go to the next slide. All right, so I'll jump into it and try to introduce some different ideas from our perspective that we haven't heard already. We had pre-COVID, like I said earlier, been accredited twice. Well, I guess the second one was during COVID, but we were working on it prior to COVID really setting in. We began COOP planning in 2010 and involved all county departments, courts, statewide partners. So continuity was not a new concept when COVID arrived. We hold all the COOPs that we help create to the standard set forth by EMAP. So we actually run a statewide program from the county. We received Homeland Security funding starting in 2010, and we help entities across Nevada create their COOP plan and COG plans as well. So that's the arrow that you see on the right side of the screen is just, we started in 2010. We did 6 counties in northern Nevada. We did Las Vegas Metro, Henderson, which is right outside of Las Vegas, and then it goes on from there. And every year we incorporate 2 additional entities, including airports, universities, but always focusing on the county and our departments as well. So, you know, that's just to reinforce that it was nothing new to us. And as someone who is leading this program, you know, we had to set the standard high, and I think, you know, EMAP helped us do that. And we were able to use EMAP to get more buy-in into our program, but vice versa as well. So most recently, we completed full county updates of our departmental plans in 2019, and that included tabletop exercises just prior to our reaccreditation. COOP evaluation prompt emails are sent biannually to all departments, and we host a monthly departmental meeting for emergency management where department heads attend, and COOP is addressed at each of those meetings as well. So COOP plans are updated and tested as we prepare for EMAP, the on-site assessment, which didn't occur. It was virtual again, but we did that in 2019, just prior to COVID, so just under the wire. We used the standards to set a guide for best practices, and that really helped because we, when COVID hit, we had a brand new county manager. I mean, 1 month in. So we were able to reassure him and our 5 elected commissioners from both political parties that these plans were in place should, you know, COVID escalate to the point where the county would be impacted operationally. So the cities and tribes are also on the COOP plan that we've organized and are up to that standard as well. And so, you know, that allowed them the opportunity to come together with county leadership in a policy group prior to COVID and discuss how to best move forward. One of the things that did occur, you know, before COVID arrived in our area was that the courts came to us and said, hey, we kind of see how this is going to go. Can we do a tabletop exercise next week to test our COOP and incorporate what COVID might look like? And so we threw it together for them, and it was so beneficial for them that other departments were clamoring, hey, can we get this before COVID gets here? And we were like, well, you know, that's probably next week. So we were able to do it for the courts, which is an essential and critical part of our government. And it was so beneficial to them that we actually ended up incorporating that into our statewide plan. So prior to that, we didn't have an exercise as a part of that planning piece. We just helped people create their plans, and it was up to them to test it and update, but it's now a part of it. So, you know, if you're going to find a silver lining in COVID, that was one of them for us. So we also held regional briefings and included our health partners, and we're sure to discuss with our community statewide partners, you know, don't forget about your COOPs, make sure that they're up to date as we head towards, you know, COVID entering our county. Next slide, please. Okay, so a lot of our challenges are the same as you've already heard or probably experienced yourself. Conversion to laptops. We had a ton of people still working on desktops, and you actually could see people dragging their desktops and monitors out of county buildings so that they could work from home when we got to that point. Also, you know, supply chains were a big issue because cameras were in high demand and they were not available. And if you did get one, it was probably incredibly expensive and of poor to mediocre quality. I know that happened to us. So, you know, initially we traditionally relied on our conference call systems, which felt outdated. And I think that we all very quickly moved on from those once the adoption of this sort of platform that we're on now was more available. Desk phones were not a logical method of contact because people weren't at their desks. So we didn't have phones to reach people who traditionally would not need a work cell phone other than email. And in Nevada, you know, another challenge for us is that Nevada revised statute requires marriage licenses to be issued at all times. So you have to be able to get that at any time. And, you know, when face-to-face contact is being limited and people are being required to stay home, you know, marriages are still required to occur in the state. Think Vegas or drive-through weddings, if you will. So how did we adapt and overcome that? Well, the county had already started transitioning to Microsoft 360 and we're cloud-based, but this is really when products like Teams took off for us operationally. We hadn't really transitioned to the use of Teams prior to COVID. Like I said, it was those conference calling systems or outdated methods of communication. I'm not utilizing the most up-to-date technology. So it pushed us in that direction. We've since transitioned to an app called Vonage, which is a computer-based phone system. So you can put it on your cell phone and people can call your desk number, but it calls to the app. Or you can have it on your computer desktop and it calls to that. So really you can receive calls wherever you are. You can also turn it off. So if you don't want work phone calls over the weekend, you can set that to sleep. So very cool that we've adopted that as well. And the result, was that we can keep our desk number and use it when we need it. The county also transitioned from desktops to laptops with docking stations. So that allowed IT to conduct a bulk purchase order of equipment at a time when laptops were probably in high demand. Having that bulk order kind of bumped us up in priority as far as purchasing versus like individual purchases. So we were actually able to do that pretty quickly. And so then when we transitioned back to, if you wanted to come into the office, you could, you didn't have to. You're able to dock that computer pretty much anywhere throughout the county. So more versatility on being mobile, if you will. So next slide. All right, so EMAP asked that we talk about how did we anticipate future waves. It was really difficult if you can think back all the way to the first wave, which in COVID years is feels like 10 years ago, right? We thought, this is the biggest wave. This is the biggest impact. We're all at home. We're all locked down. So this is the worst case scenario. But in emergency management, we know that it can always get worse. And as a previous presenter mentioned, there's a number of other disasters going on at the same time. We had 13 identified in our region, and we must have ticked off about half of them that year. So, that's just to say that response is scalable, right? All response, if you're planning for it correctly. So we planned for worst case scenario, and then we're able to scale down from there or back up as appropriate. And bigger waves did come. So our stockpiling of PPE, our open communication with departments on how the county was going to support them and what that meant for them versus the public, how we were supporting public as well. Those lines of communication were open and utilized frequently. And that, we had all of those set up in COOP within our departments ahead of time. How were we going to communicate with one another? Let's test different methods of communication going down and how we can overcome that. Next slide, please. Oh, you know what? I will say just one last thing. We just went to Emmitsburg, or the FEMA training campus, and did the community-wide exercise of catastrophic earthquake with cascading events. And we were really able to, throughout that exercise, mention our COOPs again, and fall back on, the level of excellence that I feel that we're at because of our engagement with EMAP and because we set ourselves to those standards. So it was really interesting, having gone through EMAP and been accredited at the same time as our COOPs were actively engaged. And then to go and then test that and remind, the 67 people from our region who were at that training, hey, remember, we're all responding to this disaster, but it's also impacting all of our agencies. So our COOPs would be activated, and what would that look like, and utilize those methods in this scenario that we're responding to. So it was just another layer. So how did EMAP help? That was one of the ways. Our COOPs and COGs were already in place for us. So then when COVID hit, it wasn't a big stretch. Like I said, the county manager was new, so it was really easy to just point him towards his COG and how that would impact him. And he was able to just really easily read through that plan and come up to date, and then know that he could rely on us to support him in it if he had any questions. But the county commissioners were all trained on it as well. And those plans were in place and disseminated appropriately with how we said we would disseminate them. Again, held to that really high standard. And then the policy group knew the plans were in place for their organization. So the cities and the tribes both had those in place as well, which just made our region more resilient and better able to focus on the challenges at hand. It also eased the anxiety of the policy group, which, if you have ever met an elected official, is not easy to do. So we were able to say, hey, here are these COOPs, they're at this standard. It's okay, take a deep breath, let's focus on other things, because the government is still operating. We're all tested and trained on it, and it's okay. It also helped us get a buy-in for excellence. So we're constantly beating the drum of COOP and EMAP. And so county departments and community partners are familiar with both. It's not new to them. It's the expectation that, they'll have them. We're there to help them through it, and they're going to get out of it what they put into it, but we're also here to help them with it. So, that's just to say that we really take a regional approach when it comes to planning here. And so EMAP helped us because we brought together all of our stakeholders and had these conversations and did these updates prior to EMAP's assessment program and subsequent accreditation. And that's kind of it for me. So I'll hand it back.
Go ahead, Kelly.
But that's it. I just said I'm handing it back.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Kelly. So now we're going to give Nick and Kelly to kind of speak to us and summarize some of those best practices and lessons learned that they identified as they coordinated the continuation of their county's operations during COVID-19. So Greg, I'll start with you if you want to identify any best practices.
Sure. Thank you, Christine. And I'll keep it real brief. I think I've mentioned most of these, but just in summary, um, the clear lines of responsibilities being established early, especially between our local public health department, which just like Nick said up in Ohio, that's not a part of county government. They don't report to the same boss that I do. But having clear lines of responsibility between that office and our office in emergency management, and understanding who was making policy decisions, and sort of setting the pace, if you will, and who was playing a supportive role. That was definitely a best practice that we will want to capture for the future, is having that set very, very early in the game. That really helped us out a lot. As far as the lessons learned, we've already talked about, the short-sightedness, if you will, of our COOP plans being written. The longest duration was a 1-month disruption. So we all know that's got to be revisited. And our planning assumptions did not adequately predict the impact of outside external forces that quite honestly were beyond our control. You can think, we've already talked about supply chain and, with PPE and technology, but also the political, what was going on in the world politically, and how it influenced everything related to COVID. We didn't adequately foresee that coming, and how it would impact us in a response operation or in a continuity operation. And the last is another planning assumption that just fell flat, and that was that we would be able to rely on the strategic national stockpile to a degree greater than what we were. We did receive some supplies from the SNS, but our planning assumption was that we would have been able to receive a lot more than we did. So those are some lessons learned. And again, I mentioned we had an after action meeting this morning. That process has been going on now for about 10 months here actively. And so these are some of the things that group is already discussing as far as lessons learned that we'll be trying to incorporate in the future planning efforts. So that's it for us.
Thanks, Greg. Nick?
Yeah, I think, we approached a public health crisis via our plans that were already developed. So and understanding our role and being flexible. And again, when you throw the continuity of operations in, while short of having a continuity of operations planning department, the basic plans that we had in place that followed all the national and EMAP guidance really gave us a starting point to at least do temporary, and then of course having to figure out the long term, and then all the other things that EMAP brings in. But even COOP, from a financial management perspective, I mean, obviously eventually the grant funds started flowing. You had to manage that money, tracking reimbursement, we had to manage that. So it was unique in COVID. Not only were you tracking your normal response cost, but then you could track your internal cost, since they covered almost everything, as long as you can link it back to a COVID response. So all of the things you put in place and the roles and responsibilities you pre-identify really help with the overall response. It's not perfect, especially since it went on for 2 years. That caused a bit of fatigue, I guess we'll call it, COVID fatigue, as I call it. But I think a lot of the points that my colleague in Gwinnett County made stand for us as well. We're probably similar county setup. So yeah, I think again, the relationships we developed beforehand, the roles and responsibilities identified beforehand, the processes and procedures that needed to be accomplished for continuity of operations helped with COVID. And then there's a lot of lessons learned to be instituted going forward. So that's what I have.
Thanks, Nick. Kelly?
thank you. You know, a lot of the same points for us as well. So, you know, realistic and regular testing of plans, frequent and timely communication, flexibility, as we've all said, and understanding of others' perspectives, maintaining, I think for our agency, maintaining political neutrality and relying on plans to guide us, dealing with the situation at hand and looking forward, but anticipating and planning for a worst case scenario while hoping for the best, right? So like we've all said, you know, these lessons and best practices continue to be learned and to be fleshed out in our after action reports. But for us, those were the biggest takeaways. You know, we did come to a point with our health district where, you know, they weren't utilizing ICS, they weren't staying within the plans, and we had to just gently guide them back to, hey, you know, this is what the plan says. This is what our coops say. Let's operate within the bounds of those plans that we all agreed upon. And it was an easy correction because of that and because of the relationships that we had already established. So thank you.
Thanks, Kelly. We'd like to just take an opportunity to thank Greg, Nick, and Kelly for joining us today and really giving us a lot of information to consider of how their counties continued their operations throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. I am going to move over to the question and answer session, and it appears that we've only had one question asking if the presentation would be available. And yes, as always, all of our webinars, especially this series, is posted on the EMAP web pages, specifically under the training webinars, and we will take care of that as soon as we can. And I just wanted to take an opportunity to mention the upcoming webinars, specifically for we're talking about COVID-19 best practices and lessons learned, and we will be talking about the coordination of public information in a webinar on June 14th, starting at 11:30. And then for any of the programs on the call that are EMAP accredited, we will host an annual reports webinar on June 16th at 11:30 as well. And you can register for those webinars as well on the EMAP webpage for training. And then obviously just wanted to share our contact information, and again, thank Greg, Nick, and Kelly for joining us today and providing this very valuable information to not only us, but the programs that joined us. So thank you so much, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day.